Hello there and welcome to this edition of The Nation. I'm Jessie Chahel. Buy now, pay later, BNPL apps are now the new hot way for, I guess, as it explains, buy things now and pay for them later. You may have noticed an increasing trend when checking out during an online purchase to pay in installments as an option. These installment plans, known as buy now, pay later, may seem like a better deal than taking on more high interest credit card debts. Well, BNPL or buy now, pay later is a short term financing that allows consumers to make purchases and pay for them at a future date, often enough interest free. Well, it's also referred to as point of sale installment loans, any other name, but BNPL arrangements are becoming an increasingly popular payment option, especially when you are online shopping. Now, using BNPL financing can be convenient for consumers, but there are some potential downsides to consider. And in a study done by the US Public Interest Research Group in the last 3 years, consumers have in fact filed 1.2 million complaints. So, what's the problem with all of this? What should we know about these sort of offers and schemes? Is it more of buy now, pay later instead of pay later? Well, today I'm joined by Datuk Paul Selvaraj, Secretary General of the Federation of Malaysian Consumers Associations, or FOMCA, to give us his insights on this matter. Datuk, welcome to the program, and it's good to speak to you again. Of course, you and the entire association, are very much on the pulse with some of these new sort of payment schemes as well. Let's first start with this: the BNPL benefits versus harm that it causes consumers. Let's begin with that landscape and scenario at this point of time, Dato.
Thank you, Jesse. Firstly, I really like your title, Buy Now, Pay Later. I think that summarizes the whole scheme. Now, one of the advantages, obviously, as you mentioned, is that you get to pay in installments, and very often it's zero interest. And one of the important things that I want to mention at this stage is because those providing these schemes are not financial institutions, they are currently not regulated. There's no meaningful oversight, and they're not subject to laws that can protect consumers against unfair practices. Now, when it comes to benefits, I think one of the most obvious benefits is that it's zero interest. When you buy now, you enjoy it now, but the pain comes later. And obviously, one of the motives is zero interest. The second benefit, of course, is very often compared to other means of getting loans, you do not need to have a very good credit score. That means even people who have high debts or other problems may be able to be qualified for this. And this is, of course, a major concern. And third benefit, of course, is for the consumers, they look at a purchase in terms of manageable payments rather than one lump sum payment, and this may be the benefit. But I think as consumers, we really want to look at the risk. Now, firstly, we say no interest. I think that may be true, but there are BNPL schemes in which there's processing fees, there's administration fees, and other forms of fees. Sometimes these are transparent, sometimes these are hidden. But I think one of the biggest risks is high late payment fees. You pay quite substantial, your payment is late. And in other jurisdictions, it's been found that when you take into consideration late payment fees, it's even higher than if you had actually paid interest. And that's a concern. The third is that because of the scheme, there's a high tendency for consumers to spend more than they can really afford. BNPL gives the illusion that an item that's actually expensive is more affordable because you only concentrate on the installment payments, and this could lead to purchasing beyond one's means. In fact, 39% even before BNPL admitted to living beyond their means. So this is a concern. And in Singapore, there's been a major concern of impulse buying. So this is
some other stats I wanted to share as well. We talk about the illusion or the disillusion of, it's okay, I'll buy it now and of course I'll pay for it later. 55% is the number of consumers who say that they tended to spend more by using the buy now, pay later than they would any other regular payment methods, because it doesn't hurt you or doesn't dig into your pocket at this point of time.
Doesn't seem to hurt you.
That's right.
So in almost yeah, in almost every country, it's been found that with BNPL schemes, people spend a lot more. People
Yeah.
spend a lot more. Yeah.
But unfortunately, in this study also, it found that only 1 out of 5 consumers who use these sort of applications or go for this kind of schemes actually really even understand how they work. So that's 20% of all consumers, and perhaps the lack of understanding can also lead very dangerously, especially in these hard times as well, to unexpected fees and damage credit, furthering credit score, and so on and so forth. Now, let's look at some of the main features of the Consumer Credit Act 2022 that will regulate the BNPL schemes. We also understand at this point that there are new laws under the Act that will be enacted to this end. Now, of particular importance, of course, is protecting the consumer and the provider of the scheme. How important is consumer education at this point, Dato, to prevent the abuse of these sorts of scheme, which I'm sure started out as quite a, you know, um, one that was
Harmless.
quite harmless.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, BNPL is fairly new to Malaysia, but in other countries, it's been around for some time, and I think we can learn from the experience. In almost every country, there is a move towards regulation because the consequences and the impact on consumers have been found to be very negative. In US, in UK, and Australia, all moving towards regulation. In fact, it's such a serious issue that Consumer International has come out globally to have call for effective regulation against BNPL products. Now, the biggest concerns before I talk of what should go into the act is it's in many countries it's not regulated because it's not a financial institution. There's no proper checks if consumers can actually afford to pay. Late fees charged, like I say, can be high, even higher than if interest had been charged. It started as something harmless, but today with BNPL, you can go for a holiday, you can go for surgery. That means it's a huge amount of money, yeah. And
Yeah.
of course, as I mentioned, BNPL leads uh, to overconsumption, could lead to overconsumption. Now, as you mentioned, Jesse, Securities Commission, Bank Negara, and Ministry of Finance is looking into the regulation of this. And some of the things that, as consumer organization, we want to suggest, based on the feedback from consumers, is that BNPL should be regulated as any other form of credit. That means we need a cap on fees. And as I mentioned, we don't know, many of them do not understand. Any financial product sometimes, although it may be transparent, it may be in language that people do not understand. So it's not just transparency. It must be in a form that's visible and in a form that's easy to understand. So that at point of sale, you know the risks. One of the risks, Jesse, that I mentioned earlier is that if you late payments, there are consequences. What happens if we still do not make those payments? Because in other countries, there's a tendency to hand this over to debt agencies, and we know all the horror stories from debt collection agencies. Now, consumers need to be aware of this when they make their decision. They shouldn't just be looking at I've got a small payment compared to paying it in full. Okay, so it needs to be regulated as any other form of credit. Now, secondly, whether it's bank loan or credit cards, can consumers afford to buy that particular item? I think this burden has also to be put on BNPL, especially B40. I mean, can they afford? If you're buying something that people cannot afford, obviously it's going to lead to financial consequences. So there must be some degree of assessment whether consumers can afford. Now, the third issue I think you mentioned very important is this. If a consumer, you had mentioned there were a lot of complaints. Where does a consumer go to when there's a complaint? Currently, there is no mechanism. Now, that's, I think, one of the lucky things, maybe by coincidence, consumer credit law is being developed. It's one of those things that FOMCA had always pushed for. Because while financial institutions are regulated by Bank Negara, non-financial institutions are not regulated. And this is where you can have exorbitant fees, exorbitant interest, all kind of consequences for late charges, and there's no one to hold them responsible for this. And
Right. So what we know at this point is Bank Negara Malaysia says they are working with the Ministry of Finance and the Securities
I see.
Commission to regulate the buy now pay later scheme as well. Now, obviously, it leaves consumers a little bit confused because there's a lot of fine print around it. But what I'd like to understand at this point as well, with all this interest that's charged, how does Grab and Lazada gain from the BNPL schemes? if they are provided this, they offer this scheme in which there's no payment or interest payment that's involved, Dato?
Okay, actually, there are two things. One is the seller, the manufacturer. The
Mhm.
other thing is the BNPL scheme itself. There are two parties. Sometimes Lazada acts as both parties, but very often there is a manufacturer or any seller, any of the branded sellers. They go to a BNPL uh, scheme. In Malaysia, as far as I know, there are 8 such schemes, and allow them to pay to use those schemes to enable consumers to pay through installments. Now, normally the BNPL schemes charges the manufacturers. I'm not sure in Malaysia, but in other countries, it's between 1.5% to 7%. So the manufacturers pay. Their intention, of course, is to increase sales. The second revenue, Jesse, we say no interest, but late charges is a huge payment for consumers, and that is a revenue. So they get from the manufacturers and also late charges or any other kind of fees on consumers. That's how BNPL consumers make money.
Okay, now, will these schemes encourage the increased usage of e-wallets or e-wallet transactions, which we also know are on the rise right now, and in the process encourage a cashless society? So could there be, besides all the dangers, could this also be encouraging enough for us to move towards a cashless society?
Actually, just said when COVID came, a lot of people, whether low income, high income, moved towards a digital and electronic platform for online purchasing, online banking, and of
I know
course,
I did for sure. Yeah, contactless.
and,
Yeah.
and, and all members of society. And I think this is so. It's not the method of payment. I think my greater concern. So when you use the word cashless society, you meant not physical cash but digital cash. But my concern is if people buy things they cannot afford, they're going to end up really like a cashless society with no money. That's a
Mhm,
bigger
mhm.
concern, you know, because if you overspend, and this is what BNPL schemes encourage, if you overspend, then it's going to have a very negative impact on consumers' welfare, and that is a bigger concern rather than whether they're using digital, because I think that's already happening. The movement towards digital and electronic payment systems.
Okay, so what happens is someone signs up to purchase something of desire, for example, and signs up with a BNPL scheme, but halfway finds himself or herself unable to continue paying. What are the penalties for non-payment that will be imposed at this juncture?
Actually, if you look at the BNPL schemes, they come out with what is the consequences of late payments and things like that. The issue is, as you mentioned, now if a consumer is not happy, he does not want to continue, while the BNPL insists on them continuing, where does he go for redress? Where does he go for a mechanism that can listen to his side as far as saying what are the situation that is facing? Currently, such mechanisms do not exist. So
Mhm.
any kind of loan systems where there is no protection, no redress for consumers, I think it's a great negative impact on consumer welfare. And this is our concern. I think that we should not carry this things out until the regulation is in place, which I think is being discussed at this stage.
Right, okay, because this could be dangerous as well for different segments of society, perhaps even young adults starting out and making big purchases, people from B40 group who need to be a bit more financially, frugal, perhaps, if I could take that angle. But we know that this scheme is not new, especially overseas in many
Yes,
Western
yes,
countries, particularly.
yes.
We do and we have seen this scheme. So, what are some of the success stories versus benchmarking and lessons that can be learned and applied towards a Malaysian, society in terms of habits and financial power?
I think there are two things. In all these countries that BNPL has been existing, the very important consequence or very important result is that all of them feel that it cannot be left unregulated. So all of them are moving towards regulation. We cannot allow this to regulate. The second point that you mentioned, very important, is also consumers also need to be empowered through a broader sense of financial education. And I would like to say that, at this point, although we have a financial national literacy strategy, I think not enough is being done to empower consumers. Of course, BNPL, but we hear of scams, we hear of so many negative things. I think we're not doing enough to empower consumers to face this kind of challenges. That's why when a scheme like BNPL comes, people take advantage, not considering, whether they have the capacity to pay. Generally, just see, even before BNPL, our savings rate is very low, our credit is very high. This could only make things worse. And this is where the regulatory mechanisms, to some extent, protects consumers from this kind of dangerous consequences of this.
That's right. While we acknowledge all of this, globally, I understand that the BNPL market size is projected to beat this number,
Yes,
3,268 billion US dollars come the year
you are right.
2030. That's
Yes,
8 years away, and it's expanding growth.
yes.
It's at about 43.8% in its forecast period from last year all the way to 2030. Its compound annual growth rate, that
So
is. So, how do we balance? How do we make sense of what's going on here?
I think, as you mentioned, it is inevitable. It's growing all over the world. The issue is really, can we regulate it? That's all we can do. You know, if we have seen the consequences of non-regulation, we see consumers getting into problems. We see issues of protection. We're seeing issues of overcharging. But if it's a regulated industry, I think regulated industry is one. The empowerment of consumers is a second component. So I think these two has to run in tandem to ensure that although it brings the benefits, consumers are empowered and the system is regulated to ensure consumer protection and consumer well-being. Left to the market, I think we have learned the negative consequences.
Perhaps one point in terms of the approval of the BNPL could be that when one is applying for the scheme, it will first need to meet certain criteria, certain credit score, or is this happening in an
No.
automatic fashion at this point?
Now, at this stage, from what I could pick up from what were the qualifications, it was simple things like citizenship, phone number, email number. There is no at all any consideration of the capacity to pay back.
Mhm.
So the it's very soft so-called credit checking. That means almost anybody can apply, as long as one of the conditions is above the age of 18. And one of the biggest consequences, not in Singapore as well in other countries, it's the young workers that many of them become,
Yeah,
who
I'm
become
I'm
this.
I'm glad you brought up other countries. From Hong Kong to Philippines as well. This scheme seems to be a tough sell because there's a lot of hype around this. But at the same time, maybe in terms of technology as well, mobile wallets are not supporting this at this point of time. Moving forward, though, what do you think the future of BNPL is like in the short term?
I think the only protection for consumers is that when they come out this Consumer Credit Act, there's a very strict regulations. Things are very transparent to consumers at point of sale, so that they know the consequences. I mean, this I've learned from other countries. Consumers must know, as long as there's a regulator, interest rates are controlled. Any kind of fees, late fees, and the biggest fear here in Malaysia often is whether your debt will end up to a debt agency. So all of those things, there has to be somebody that we can turn to. And the second thing is continuous empowerment of consumers through financial education at every level, whether it's young workers, especially young workers, but for all, so that they begin to understand to manage their own finances, the importance of savings, the importance of managing debts. This is just another form of debt, planning the future. I mean, if you recently saw the EPF thing, the crowds, people do not have enough to face emergencies, but people are still spending. So this is where consumer empowerment comes into place. And I think that can only happen through continuous financial education. So that
Okay,
that's has
speaking
the
of
way from.
consumer empowerment, of course, how do we reach out to those in rural areas, in the outskirts, the B40s, in the kampungs and the estates? They may see this scheme and fall prey to it. And also, is the application process entirely online? How does it then facilitate them because of the mode of easy payment? Perhaps, for some items and for some important equipment, it may be a scheme that is suitable for the B40 at this point.
Actually, Jesse, even before COVID, I mean, FOMCA took the responsibility. I mean, we worked with the central bank and others to reach out to the poorest of poor. We reached out physically, and of course also through online. So this kind of education, because the decision making is so fast, there's a tendency for impulse. It makes it so easy. One click and you've bought the thing and you've tied into the scheme. So
Yeah.
this is where continuous education, and sometimes for the poor, at least from my opinion, face to face is much more effective, because then they begin to realize, they can ask questions, they can bring out their own doubts. Online education is good. We have done that. But when we want to affect people's behavior, change of behavior, I think face-to-face, interactive. But that is the way forward. I think this kind of schemes will always be there. But unless consumers learn to protect and manage their finances and take care, precaution, especially in the way they manage their debts, I think it's going to be tough.
All right, so we know that with the BNPL, it starts out with a payment in installments and that too at zero interest, but there are many hidden charges, for example, processing fees and then high interest on late payment fees as well. What Bank Negara has said that in some cases, the total charges levied by the BNPL providers on customers may actually be higher at the end of the day than the total charges and interest imposed by conventional lenders as well. So once again, back to your point in terms of the education and the understanding of exactly how these schemes.
But on this issue,
work.
it's not education, Jesse. It's more of they can charge what they want because there is nobody to regulate them.
Correct. So, which leads me to my next
Ah,
question. Will the price of things that people buy under BNPL be jacked up to reflect the later pay later scheme? And then who regulates the items that are under the BNPL scheme?
no, the BNPL scheme itself, the prices of items are not regulated. And anyway, from my information from other jurisdictions, prices do not go up actually, generally speaking, because they expect, when people spend easily, they will buy more. That's the expectation. People will buy more. But the interest rates, the hidden charges, as you had mentioned, the hidden charge, I mean, the late payment charges are higher than interest. That's, of course, great injustice. And they can do that because today nobody is regulating the interest rates. Nobody is regulating late charges. There is no institution. There is no law. So the law must regulate. I mean, even whether it's the banks, credit cards, Bank Negara regulates. So that consumers will get a fair deal. Consumers cannot tell the BNPL companies about interest rates. Only the regulator can. So the longer they are unregulated, the more consumers' welfare, consumer protection is in jeopardy. I would say jeopardy. So this is where we hope that these schemes are not allowed to function until regulation comes into place and everybody has to follow the regulations, which of course ensures the viability of the industry. We do not deny that, but equally important, the protection and the welfare of consumers.
That's right. Speaking of protection and welfare of consumers, if one does not make payment or makes payment late or ends up even being blacklisted, does the consumer then, will the consumer be allowed to undertake other BNPL transactions? For example, if he buys something on a certain e-commerce platform and then defaults there, is he able to go to another e-commerce platform and then start another scheme enrollment there?
But even if it defaults, he still has to pay. And that's the issue of the consequence. What happens if cannot pay? What is the consequence? The provider is not going to just cancel the debt.
Yeah.
So he's going to give it maybe to a debt agency. Then you have the horror stories. Or else, you have to work with AKPK to resolve these issues. So we have to address the issue of consumers who cannot pay. And if you go to one bank and you cannot get the money, you go to another bank, you also cannot, because somehow information is shared. At this stage, it may or may not be shared. But I think the point here is that when we talk of blacklisting, we talk of consumers who cannot pay. We have not put into a mechanism where those who cannot afford to pay are still being offered these schemes. If you're blacklisted in one and you're going to another, your financial situation is only going to get worse.
That's right.
No,
What
no,
we're hearing is that many consumers misunderstand the entire scheme and how it works as well. And of course, it needs to be regulated. I think our discussion today definitely points to one fact that it needs to start with regulation there, and more stakeholders really playing a bigger part in ensuring how it's offered and where it's offered, and how it trickles down to the consumer is also something that is carefully understood by all segments. What is the bottom line of all of this before I let you off, Datuk?
Two things. One is at the point of sale, consumers obviously know the benefits, but they must know all the risks. That's crucial. Number two, we need to do more to empower consumers, of course on BNPL, but generally on better managing their finances. I think this is the way forward for consumers.
So
That's
thank you
my
very
final
much
thought.
for your time today. It's been an interesting conversation and definitely an eye opener for consumers as well as they move towards, more interesting times ahead in the new norm with borders opening. I'm sure there's a lot of shopping and there's a lot of buying of needs online as well. Dato will speak to you very soon again. That was, of course, Dato Paul Silveraj, Secretary General of the Federation of Malaysian Consumers Association, FOMCA, weighing in a little bit on the buy now, pay later, or is it buy now, pay later scheme? Well, that's all from me, Jessie, on The Nation today. Thanks so much for watching and take care. Bye bye.